So greetings, everyone. I'd like to thank you for participating in our third lecture series. This is our third one out of the year. We have two more to go. Um, the lecture series was born out of wanting to continue the conversations that we've been having with Akom Kessie. So for those who participated in Akom Kessie, you know, we've had um, some really robust and deep conversations during the course of those events. And what we wanted to do was to have another option of being able to continue those conversations that we had during the course of the event. So a Combe Kessie lecture series was born out of that, with the vein of continuing the conversation. So as an organization, what we're interested in doing is sharing information, sharing perspectives, um, with the Akom or Khan perspective, from our traditional perspective. We want to be able to share information so that we can empower our people to grow and to be able to go to different levels in terms of their personal and spiritual development. So that's the genesis of the Akom Kessie lecture series. All the series have been attended very well. Very happy with the information that we've been able to present to the community. And again, we want to continue to do that. So today, in that vein, we are having Dr. Jonathan Vital present on epigenetics, or trauma that's passed on from generation to generation. So with that said, I would like to do a quick intro of him. So Dr. Jonathan D. Vital, PhD, AKA Nana Obrafohene Kwaw, is a licensed clinical neuropsychologist, as well as a certified clinical sex offender treatment specialist in the state of Maryland, as well as District of Columbia. He is currently the clinical coordinator at the Center for Children St. Mary's location, which is a rural county in Southern Maryland. Dr. Vital's formal education includes a bachelor's degree in psychology from Tuskegee University, a master's degree in community psychology from Florida A&M University, and doctoral level training in the discipline of neuropsychology from Howard University. So Dr. Vital we're both HBCU babies. So all my training is from HBCUs as well. So we have that in common. Dr. Vital is an experienced licensed psychologist with a wealth of knowledge in various forms of psychological evaluations, and therapeutic treatment. Beyond his ability to provide thorough neuropsychological evaluations among various populations.
Alert from no backups for 19 days.
These computers. Psychological evaluations, psychoeducational evaluations, psychosocial evaluations, psychosexual and risk assessment for various client populations. This multi-perspective assessment training experience allows him to gain a greater insight into the various recalcitrant factors many clients may have in their clinical presentation among the various populations that he is experiencing, evaluating, and treating. Dr. Vital has conducted over 300 court-ordered clinical psychology, neuropsychological, and certificates of need evaluations among the juvenile offender population on behalf of the Department of Juvenile Services in Maryland alone. While his expertise is in conducting various forms of evaluation, he also has an acumen for providing psychotherapy and brief therapeutic counseling services. He has a range of experiences with individual and group therapy modalities in which he makes use of an eclectic range of therapeutic techniques and approaches to treat various client populations, ranging from those having suffered from various forms of trauma to those with perpetuated trauma, such as sex offenses. In addition to his professional practices, Dr. Vital or also known as Nana Obrafohene Olokwasu Kwaw. And I know I just butchered that. Olokwesu Kwaw.
Yeah.
Olokwesu Val Vital has been a spiritual practitioner within the Akom tradition of the Akan people of Ghana, West Africa, for over 25 years. He currently has his own shrine, i.e. a Surjabi Ahenfi, together with the Konfo Amo Parabia, to whom he has been married for over 20 years. Nana Obrafo Kwaw was installed as Obrafohene in 2003 by the elders of Nana Surjabi Shrine in Kubiase, Akwapim Latte, Ghana, West Africa, as well as the Council of Elders in America in 2021. So as you can see, Nana Obrafohene is very well qualified to talk on this particular topic. So before I bring him up, though, I would like to greet all of the elders that are in the room. Nana Amadama, who's on the Council of Elders, Nana AC, Ayisi Denizulu, greetings. Anyone else in here that I'm not aware of? Nana Henny, thank you for coming. We definitely appreciate your support and in this in particular endeavor. Lastly, we have board members who are on the call. If you have anything you would like to say, please use this time to say a few words. We have Yao Tyus, who is the vice president of the board. We have Nana Ama Vital, who also is a member of Akom Kesi. And then we have my beautiful wife, Andrea Moa, who's on the board as well. So please, if you have a few words you would like to say, this is your time. I don't know, y'all never this quiet in board meetings.
Welcome to you all. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Enjoy the evening.
I'll say ditto to that. Brother Yao, welcome, welcome, welcome. Look forward to hearing this lecture series. It's going to be very informative. Recently, I also did a quick lecture series on utilizing the Board of Elders to try to get remedy to any type of issues that you may have dealing with your families, dealing with your spouses, dealing with spousal. And I believe that this lecture series talk will definitely accentuate what I was saying about trying to deal with the Board of Elders for all of our issues instead of going through the court system. So I definitely look forward to that. And every day I see trauma coming forth before me, and it's a circle. So we definitely need to stop it. So I am looking forward to this talk.
I would just like to say welcome, and I also am looking forward to hearing what Dr. Vital has to say. I am in transport to pick up our daughter from the airport, so I'm not on camera and I'm going back on mute. Enjoy.
All right.
Okay.
All right, without further ado, Dr. Vital, Obrafohene, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay. So first of all, particularly in this space, I prefer Nana Obrafo or Nana Obrafo Kwaw. Even though the bio has a lot of doctor this, doctor that, I mean, you just kind of have to put out, you know, what your experience and credentials are. But particularly in this space, you know, this is a home space, that a be real space. So that's what I prefer to go by in this space. To Andrea's point, I think that this talk is important to that, because the previous discussion, when I say that, dealing with the contextualizing our people's experience using natural systems, in other words, to deal with our people's trauma, and knowing how to build, to work as, particularly as people, the people here are spiritual practitioners, many of them, or know spiritual practitioners and can refer individuals in need.
Mipacho Nana,
Yes.
I forgot to acknowledge Brother Okonfo Valdemir Kwaw. I didn't see him on the call.
Mhm.
So Mipacho, let me just quickly acknowledge him as one of the board members. I'm not sure if there's something that you'd like to say. And I apologize, I didn't see you on the call.
No problem at all. Jumbo, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm just happy to hear this information that's coming up. Hi. That's
My
it.
apologies, my apologies.
No, please, no apologies necessary at all, man. Please, everything is cool, man.
Mhm.
I'm sorry,
Okay.
Nana. You can go. You can continue.
Okay, so so this discussion, as well as the previous discussion that I had concerning reviewing the history of psychology and how it was purposed for the Western culture, really taken out of natural systems that we had before and constructs and principles that we had before, and they purposed it for themselves. And it's only when they began to deal with the conundrum of trauma that certain therapists began to realize that, okay, what we have in the systems that we developed or how we purpose this thing for ourselves doesn't work. So we have vast hordes of clientele that we're not able to treat. And so that's when they began to discover, that's when they act like they are the ones that are like, this stuff is new. You know how the European does that. When they come upon something, that's when it's discovered and that's when it's new. So they began to discover these old world approaches, these Eastern approaches, yoga and different forms of meditation and mindfulness and systems of movement that really was a part of our culture. And so what I was, that talk was designed to elicit individuals who would be consumers of mental health services to compel them, like, yes, you need to use mental health services. We are people who have been traumatized. We are in need of these type of services, and seek out relevant services and that from a culturally conscious, African-centered, aware therapeutic approach. And for those who are professional practitioners in terms of the discipline of mental health, suggesting that we need to reclaim our culture and our cultural systems, because those are the systems that are healing. So what I was suggesting then at that time is that we need to re-Africanize our approach to mental health and to reclaim our culture. And that system of cultural reorientation is going to be the system of building healing and resilience. So this talk, in that talk, this is one of the reasons why I brought that up, and not just piggybacking on what Andrea had mentioned, but in that talk, I mentioned, I spoke a lot about trauma and how it impacts the brain. And I mentioned the epigenetic factor and the intergenerational trauma, and how post-traumatic slavery that Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about, how these things have impacted upon it. I only made mention of it in that talk. So I'm attempting, Kwesi had approached me after doing that talk and said that, that's something that we need to deal with more. And so he asked me to develop this. So this talk is a new development. And I appreciate the fact that he set me down this path, because it's necessary. It's something that I needed to develop. But I tried to develop this in a way, particularly for this audience, because you do have a lot of culturally centered people, and as well as spiritual practitioners. So I want to structure this talk in a way that was relevant, that I'm talking about, scientific and professional content, but I'm also making it relevant to our experience and how we can, there's things that we can do as spiritual practitioners and the way we should approach our work that also deals with this system of or this phenomena of epigenetics or trauma that has spanned it over generations. So having said that, let me pull up, let me share my screen and we can get started on what we have here. I don't suppose this would be too long a talk. Again, it's developmental for me at this point. Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right. So. All right, so basically what we're talking about is the transmission of intergenerational trauma. And this can be applied not just to trauma, but this is how systems of behavior are transmitted and traits are transmitted intergenerationally. But from our interest point, we're going to look at the transmission of intergenerational trauma, the cultural and spiritual implications of epigenetics. So let me just read this basic viewpoint on or explanation of epigenetics, which is the field of study that reveals how early experiences shape the way genes are regulated. And that's from Dan Siegel. And he goes on to indicate that, in particular, epigenetics refers to the manner in which experience produces neuronal firing, which in turn selectively turns some genes on and other genes off by way of changing the chemical controls in the nuclei of the neuronal cell. So even within well, he indicates that there's some genes that are turned on and there's some genes that are turned off, but also another way of looking at it, and you'll see a little bit later in some of the explanations of epigenetics, is that even within a gene, their inscription, there'll be certain switches within that gene codes that will be turned on and certain switches that will be turned off so that you can get a certain expression more efficiently expressed or specifically expressed. And so he goes on to say the net result is to alter the way neurons grow in specific regions of the brain. In specific regions of the brain, creating long-lasting structural changes following an experience. So these are changes, and you'll see in the next slide, that will take place within the organism. And I'll speak of organisms as well as person, because a lot of the studies are done on non-humans, obviously, because some of these, it would be unethical to do these studies on humans. But the organism is modified itself. But that modification then later on takes on a different expression of the gene that can be passed on intergenerationally. So here's a slide. I took this slide from the previous talk where I spoke on how the trauma will impact different systems within the brain, and you have a trauma brain or a trauma brain profile. So this slide talks about epigenetics, experience, how experience changes the brain. So various neuroscience research findings reveal that people exposed to severe stress early in life have genes which are activated that continue to shape neuronal growth throughout the child's life into adulthood. So what this is talking about, and it's taken from a study that I'll kind of explain a little bit more later. I'll go into a longer explanation of it. But it's talking about the young impact, the impact of trauma on a young person in particular, and how that trauma experience will rewire that person's brain. And that's what I talked about before. But what we're going to go on to talk about is how that rewiring can then modify that person's behavior and how they interact with their children. But not only that, but how their genes are transcribed and how their genes are modified and expressed. And that also will be passed on. So like in this example, this is this really kind of shows you how different areas of the brain that would be impacted by trauma. This is the amygdala. This is a subcortical brain structure. So this is a brain structure that this designed to express raw emotion. So this is part of the limbic system. This left hemisphere would express more fear, be responsible for more fear expression. This right hemisphere would be responsible for more of a, no, excuse me, the left would be responsible for anger expression, and the right would be responsible for more fear expression. And so in a traumatized brain, what we have is a system that shuts down the functioning and regulation of the left hemisphere and heightens the expression and dysregulates the expression of the right hemisphere. So the relevance of things are exaggerated. That's why maybe a depressed person might overemphasize things, have cognitions like, or thoughts like, no one likes me, no one loves me. It exaggerates different negative qualities. And this left hemisphere suppression would indicate a brain where there's a lack of learning ability, a lack of critical thinking, and the hypervigilance. And this anterior cingulate area of the brain, which is a cortical area, but is part of the limbic system, it regulates the integration between thought and how emotions are expressed. So it identifies relevant aspects of a stimuli or the environment, and it interprets it as in which way is it relevant. So when that's suppressed in a trauma brain, things are exaggerated in terms of their relevance, and the person becomes hypervigilant, or the person becomes unable to sustain attention on one particular thing. They're always searching for the predation, or searching for someone that may harm or compromise survival. So this type of, the reason why I'm going on about the different types of changes that can happen in the brain from trauma is to show you that if that then is transcribed into the genes to express, even when the organism itself, like the offspring, has not had that experience, it can still have a brain that is wired in that way. So when I give an example for a child presenting to me like that may have ADHD, so it may be incumbent upon me not just to ask about, okay, what's going on with this child's current experience, but what is going on with that parent experience and that parent's parent experience. And you often find that, well, his dad had ADHD. And then if you find out what's going on with that environment. So ADHD is not a thing that you have per se, but it's a behavioral profile that can be expressed if the brain is modified in certain ways. So let's go into the next one. So, okay, this is the study by Meany that I was talking about. So this diagram comes from that study. And so I'll just use this diagram as a way to kind of summarize what that study or that paper is looking at. And it's looking at rodent behavior. So this diagram is the potential outcomes of the relationships or relationship between environmental adversity and infant care. So it's looking at the way that these rodents or mice cared for their young based upon their experience. And so you can kind of understand this in terms of how a human might experience certain environments that are adverse or adversarial as well. So in these studies, they had environments that were low level, that had low levels of resources. So mainly this would be food for a rodent. High predation, so they were in fear of being preyed upon. There's social turmoil in some instances. There could be overcrowding or isolation and aggression in certain situations. And so in putting the rodent in these adversarial environments or these contentious environments, it caused maternal, particularly for the female mice, this is what they were studying, it caused maternal anxiety. And that impacted on the anxiety that the that the mother mouse felt, or the mother rodent felt, impacted on the type of care she provided to the young. So there's either they created environments to where the rodent the mother had to leave the burrow for long distances to find food, and that left the young alone for long periods of time, or there was some other type of adversity that they put the mother through, so that the mother was hyper vigilant and she became less attentive to the pups, is what the baby rodents are called. So she became less attentive to the pups, and so that inattentiveness signaled to their brains that something is wrong in the environment. So the mother was experiencing the adversarial environment, then her maternal care changed. That signaled to those pups, those baby mice, that they needed to make different neuronal changes in their brain. So they had an increase in corticotropin releasing factor, which is associated with cortisol associated with stress. And they had a decrease in certain neurotransmitters that help to inhibit certain neural responses. So they had a dysregulation, if you will. And they had, because they were getting less licking and grooming behavior, or less attentiveness from the mother, there was a decrease in the oxytocin, which is a hormone neurotransmitter that is released when we engage in activities like touching, handshaking, hugging, cuddling, kissing, caressing. You know, this hormone or this neurotransmitter is responsible why we find those things beneficial and satisfactory, as well as dopamine. Anything that we consider to be satisfaction or satisfactory or rewarding is a dopamine is responsible for that. So there's a decrease in these type of neurotransmitters, and that created, let's go down this path first. That created a change or adjustment in the neural development to where they had a dysregulation in the limbic, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis. So that's that axis that where the emotional response is not regulated in the environment. So there's the inability to deal with stress because of the increased release of the neural hormonal transmitter cortisol. So there's a decrease in the ability to handle stress, and the increase in the fight or flight sympathetic nervous system response becomes dysregulated. And so that lack of coping stress profile, as well as the decreased propensity or likelihood that they are desiring to be nurturing, was passed on to the pups, and they changed their maternal behavior. And then not only did they change their behavior, but at the same time, their generation, the generation that they produced, had a neural development that was consistent with how this mother treated her pups. So not only did the behavior change, but the actual the genes change. So this is the epigenetic jump. So because of the experience of the grandparent, this F2 generation had neural development consistent with how these pups were treated. So it's not just a behavioral or a learning thing, but it's the genes cause the neurons to develop in a way that are more efficient. So what the system is seeking, this is a survival system, in other words. So every system or every organism or every person seeks survival. That's the first order of existence, is survival. And so what this paradigm is saying, or what this model is showing us, is that the nature is going to assume that the environment that the grandmother had, the children will have, and the grandchildren will have. So what nature says is like, okay, we're not going to wait for any type of behavioral response or for the pups or the offspring to experience the changes. We're going to rewrite the code so that they get more efficient functioning to be able to survive. Because if they need to be hyper vigilant because there's a predator around or there's no food around and they need to make sure that they are very alert to be able to find that food, we need to make it so that they are efficient in doing that. So we're going to change the genes so that the brain can have neural pathways that are heightened for that type of activity. So it's meant to be a survival approach. So it's not necessarily as maladaptive as we might want to initially assume, but things become maladaptive when they're not able, when there's a new environment or when situations change, or like in humans, we're not just geared towards survival, but we want to thrive. We want to advance ourselves. So just staying in a survival modality, and we're likely to come out of the survival of the predatory or the adversarial conditions. So now we need to shift to a different form of function, and that doesn't happen. And that's what makes the changes maladaptive. So here's a video that just kind of, I think this is a good video to show, because I don't know if you could, I gave the light version. I didn't go into all of the, the nerdy details, but it's still good to, I'm a visual person, and these types of things are helpful for me. So the rest of the slides will be a lot of images, but I have this one video that really kind of, I think, brings home the idea and the understanding.
The sweet smell of fruit doesn't normally send rats running, but when researchers paired the orange cherry almondy scent of the chemical acetophenone with a painful electric shock, lab rats quickly learned to fear it. Along the way, extra neurons sprouted in their noses and in the smell processing center of their brains, making them super sensitive to the scent. This result isn't shocking. What is surprising is that the rats' pups and their pups' pups were also startled by the smell of acetophenone and had the same extra neurons as their fathers, despite never having been introduced to either their dads or the fruity scent before. But how could the pups have inherited something that their fathers learned? Basic genetics tells us that only DNA gets passed along to offspring. Characteristics like memories, scars, or giant muscles can't get passed on since acquiring them doesn't alter the genetic code. But it turns out that instilling fear in the rats did trigger genetic changes, not in the DNA sequence itself, but instead in how that code was read and used in the rats' bodies. In every cell, biological machinery constantly translates DNA into the proteins needed to carry out vital processes. Chemical switches attached to the DNA turn genes on or off or up and down, telling the machinery which proteins to produce and in what quantities. These switches, called epigenetic tags, are why a kidney cell looks and acts differently than a skin or nerve cell, even though all three cells have identical DNA. But the switches in any one cell aren't set in stone. Teaching those rats to fear the fruity smell switched one of their smell sensing genes into overdrive. Researchers don't know all the places in the rats' bodies where this switch got flipped, but they know it happened in one key set of cells, the rats' sperm cells, which would one day pass along the tweaked genetic material, making the next generation of rats super sensitive to acetophenone. Rodents aren't the only creatures demonstrating this weird type of inheritance. In Ivakalik, Sweden, boys who suffered through tough winter famines went on to have super healthy sons with extremely low rates of heart disease and diabetes. And their sons had the same excellent health, living an unbelievable 32 years longer on average than the grandsons of boys who hadn't gone hungry. To be clear, this does not mean that we should start starving our kids for the benefit of future generations. Scientists don't even know yet exactly which switches the Swedish famines flipped. While we have been able to connect specific epigenetic changes to health effects in mice, we're a long way off from being able to make those connections in humans. That may sound like a bummer, but it's mostly because we humans don't live in the well-controlled environment of a laboratory. And for that, we should be grateful.
Okay. So this video kind of gives a nice synopsis of it, but it also highlights the fact, a couple of things. One, that it's not just a learning thing. It's not a social learning. So social learning, these things happen. It's not like we're in a vacuum and only one factor is relevant to our lives and relevant to our experience. But this shows that outside of social learning, that there are gene modifications that can take place that can be transmitted and transmit behavioral traits and proclivities and tendencies onto offspring. So that's, one point that should be taken from here. The other point is that what was clear was that the changes that we saw epigenetically took place in the male rodent sperm cells, because that's an important factor, because other such studies have shown, even in humans, that trauma that is experienced by a prepubescent child, so a child whose gonads are not fully formed or whose hasn't gone through puberty, that trauma is going to get inscripted on those genes, those reproductive genes in particular. So it's going to more easily transcribe those experiences into the genes of the offspring and into the all the way into the the grandchildren for experiences that the grandchildren hadn't not even come close to experience, but they have gene expressions that give them those tendencies. So that's an important factor to bring up. So, okay. So let's look at, this is a slide that I actually had in the previous presentation. And I talk about attachment theory and trauma. So attachment theory is how we bond and make healthy attachments, or the extent to which we do or don't make healthy attachments to our primary caregiver. And the most primal caregiver is the mother. And our neurodevelopment is highly attached to our nervous development of our nervous system is highly attached to that bond that's created with the mother and how the mother experiences stress, particularly when she's pregnant. It's stress that is experienced by a pregnant mother can substantially alter the neurodevelopment, of a child that will have long-lasting effects and even epigenetic effects. But even in infancy, once the child has been born and there's the bonding between the mother and the child, there's still important development that's happening through that maternal infant interaction. As you can see in the example of the study with the rodents, the mother mice and the pups that we talked about, the mini study or article. So this says an infant's capacity to cope with stress is correlated with certain maternal behaviors, as well as maternal factors influence the development of the limbic, hypothalamic, pituitary adrenal axis. So that's the limbic system. Turn my little pointer back on. The limbic system, that's the emotional aspect or portion of the brain. And this is also a portion of our emotional expression. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is that it activates the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, in other words, how we deal with stress and from an emotional standpoint. So poor attachment along with trauma experience is known to result in the lack of capacity to emotionally self-regulate, expressed in the loss of ability to regulate the intensity and duration of affects and emotions. So I saw this a lot, and I still see it a lot, but particularly when I used to work in the youth detention centers, you would see some of the guys who just really couldn't regulate their emotions, like small things that shouldn't, be an issue will set them way off. And then if they go off, the duration of their escalation just goes on and on and on, and it doesn't have a stop. It's very difficult for them to come down from it. Even if you have a very calm and rational conversation, say, hey man, look, you gotta get yourself together. And they were like, yeah, man, I know. But I'm telling you, like the next 5 minutes, something could happen. They're gone and just lost it. And everything that you talk to them could be out the window. So that phenomenon that I'm observing at that time is most certainly from them having poor attachment, and not only poor attachment, but there's some trauma experience happening at the same time, but they can't now regulate because their nervous system is not cultivated to deal with the stress because of the poor attachment. So this next bullet, consequently, healthy attachment trumps trauma and increases the capacity for resilience. So what resilience is then is the capacity for an organism or entity or person to maintain their core integrity, their core sense of health and well-being, despite some, adversarial or some contravening or contradicting stimulus. It can maintain system functioning and system integrity. That's what resilience is. And so when one has that healthy attachment, even when an experience happens to that person or organism, that organism can kind of maintain itself because of that healthy attachment. They can deal with it. And so that's why sometimes you see some people who might deal with stress or deal with a trauma, they don't appear to be traumatized by an experience, and another person is just thrown all out of sorts. So that healthy attachment is important, and particularly as we're going to talk about this next thing. So also this was taken from the previous discussion that I had, and how cultural orientation equals that resilience. So embedded within our culture were those systems and those interactions, those maternal interactions that compelled that bond between a mother and an infant. And that you can kind of see in this culture there, we set up cribs in different rooms for the child, things like that. Or we set the child in a rocker versus carrying a child on our back while while we're working. But what's happening here with this child attached, and this child attached, it just seems like the child is just there, but there's important neuronal development that is happening because of this interaction, because of this walking around with mom, and this skin to skin contact is happening through the natural breastfeeding and the touch, the oxytocin that is being released and the dopamine that is being released, and there's strong neural development that is happening here. So is developing an integral, resilient person. So our natural culture, a natural state of existence is that it promotes health and promotes well-being. And to me, I put this line in here because that suggests to me the role of fathers in mitigating stress for the mother. So in our African, so we're talking about systems, as Andrea talked about, you see people come in and they have fragmented systems, and they come in with trauma because of these fragmented systems, and the dad is not there to buffer and to help to ease the stress. When the mother has to be hyper vigilant, that impacts the offspring here. And that same sense of hypervigilant and anxiety is transmitted, to the child, because the mother's having to fight off things that she shouldn't have to fight off. So the role of the father is to try to create a safe and protective space. And that, system is what helps promote, well-being in the offspring. So what happens? What about historical trauma? So how does this historical and intergenerational trauma, impact us in particular, particularly those of us those Africans who have been taken and dispersed into the diaspora. And we went through a Maafa, Holocaust, trauma, transatlantic slave experience. And so now think about what I've talked about before, where the mother had an experience that the children did not have, but yet and still that created behaviors within the child because the mother's experience was sensed by the child, and neural development occurred in that child, and gene transcription or epigenetic factor changes happen that were transmitted to the grandchildren. So now what happened with us is we had generation after generation, 400 years of generation that's experiencing trauma and trauma and trauma. And so the mother is learning not to attach to these children, because she may very well, the child may be stripped away from, may be killed, she may be shipped off, or the child may be shipped. So a mother, it would behoove a mother for her own sanity and survival, not to create a great substantial attachment to that child. And that's creating a trauma transcription within that child and gene change. And that child is also experiencing over generation and generation the exact same environment. Remember what I said, the genes, the survival code is this, of nature is like, hey, the mother's environment, the parent's environment, we assume that that's going to be the child's environment. So we're going to make these children or this offspring less attached and less have a decreased proclivity to want to make a bond with their offspring. And other I'm just using bonding as one aspect, but other aspects of trauma that were occurring to us, you know, that's what's being transcribed. And so we're experiencing the same environment that the child or that the parent was in, and then the same environment over generations and hundreds of generations, to even coming out of slavery and Jim Crow. There's still, the trauma may have lessened to a certain extent or modified itself, and it wasn't as acute, but still is traumatic. And even today is not as acute, but there's still reminders in the culture when you see the Trayvon Martins and the what's the sister that they bust in the door and shot? Forget that sister's name, but we still see these reminders of us in the Buffalo situation of being gunned down and hunted down in this culture. So it just kind of relubricates that genetic code, saying like, yep, it's still relevant. We still need to stay in, keep a head down and, you know, stay in survival mode. And we don't come out to thrive and to feel that sense of mastery of self, because we're stuck in this survival mode that's been transmitted over generation and generation and generation. And sometimes we, many of us will talk to each other like, I don't know what's wrong with us. Like, why do we do this? Why don't we bond? How come we can't make it? How come we can't advance? How come we don't trust each other? Because these are genetic codes and patterns that were written. So we know that they, you know, when George DeGroot talks of the post-traumatic slave syndrome and different other scholars talks about the things that we learned. But what epigenetics now is suggesting that it's not just the learning that's transmitted, because even when the culture is not necessarily prevalent for a person, there's a genetic propensity for a person to have these traumatic or trauma expressions. So even if there's little subtle cultural indicators that we should go to the back door, we readily go to the back door because we're wired to go to the back door, as Carter G. Woodson said. So, you know, previously I talked about the African-centered approach to mental health is to increase, or that experience is what causes the trauma, and you have to experience your way out of it. So it's experience that, you know, we went through cultural misorientation and slavery and Jim Crow and the police state, you know, the new version of lynching that we experience, you know, today. We have to be able to provide natural cultural systems and what they call wraparound supports in the social service system. But what we need to create is a full, holistic, integrated cultural experience where we can experience out and begin to build our families. So it's a cultural reorientation from that standpoint. So that's from the mental health standpoint. Now, as spiritualists, there's, you know, greater implications that aren't talked about, or that we can't talk about from the professional standpoint, and when we're in our professional environment, that we can now we can broach, you know, those topics. And that's the generational curse and the spirit and the spiritual person. Because we know that we look at the totality of a person, and even those things that you can't put a finger on, as how is this thing traveling from one generation and traveling through this family line. So now we're talking about not just our total, you know, experience from the post-traumatic slavery system that we all collectively experience, but there's certain family line things that our family in particular, specific traumas unique to our families that we experience, and it travels along with us. And you say, how did this person, so-and-so's grandfather was alcoholic? You know, how is it that, you know, he didn't even know his grandfather? So how is this thing traveling along, you know, with him? So what I'm suggesting here is that there is the epigenetic scientific explanation, but there's also, we know that there's also spirit that goes along with a physicality, and that there's a bond between the spiritual and the physical world. And I'm suggesting that there are two approaches. So me as a psychologist, a mental health professional, and me as a traditional African practitioner, spiritual practitioner, I know I have a double modality or approach that I can take for the healing of the person. So I don't just consider the person, oh, this is just some physical or mundane experience or a complex or phenomenon, but there's a spiritual aspect that I know I also have to attend to. So let's talk about the African, particularly the Akan conception of the person. And so the Nkrabia, the decree of life, so that's our destiny, and how that is an important aspect of the person and who we are. So the composition of the person. So look at the left side, we have the Okra, Okara, Okra, there's different versions, but that's the soul. That's our most, you know, inner self, the Sum Sum. And what scholars agree that the most appropriate interpretation of the Sum Sum is the person's spirit or their personality of self-expressiveness. It's the Honam, the physical body. And this is important in understanding the person, because it shows from, you know, the most ethereal or spiritual aspect of the person to the most concrete, you know, phenomena of the person, and how there's a close tie between the Honam and the soul and the expression, how what happens here impacts here, and what can be impact, what happens here and here can impact here. And so there's another aspect of a person that is a collective or a collective self, meaning that it's a composition of the person genetically or the person's family transmitted self. So the entoral or the character traits transmitted from the father through the semen, and the moja, those character traits or those the fundamental genetic aspect that's provided by the mother. So these are, and that's because this thing is intergenerational transmitted. So you can see how it has the same resonance and tone and idea of an epigenetic factor. And what happens here is, you know, epigenetically can be transmitted, you know, to impact the total experience of the person here and here. Okay, so this is just more explanation of the soul, Okra, the inner self, innermost self, essence of the individual person. It is pure and incorruptible. And this is the part when we are deceased, it goes back, you know, to where it came from, goes back to God. It is a soul that is given the decree of life or our destiny by Nyakupo. So The sum sum, or the personality, I put a color wheel here, and I'll explain that in a minute. So it refers to the activity, the activating principle of the person, the activating principle of the person. It is the sum sum that experiences the world, and it's through the sum sum that the okra manifests itself in the world of expression. So in other words, the sum sum and the okra and the sum sum ride together. And the sum sum is it can be any of these number of expressions or combination of expression. And if you can look at this color wheel as, deities or spirits or personalities and ways that the soul can express itself. So I like this next slide to show the okra and the sum sum together. And I like this one in particular. You can see the core, the person, the core soul, and how it has, like, the sum sum can be seen as the clothes that the soul will wear. And it's how the soul will express itself in the world and experience the world. And it can have all of these different combinations of color and different deities associated with its expression. And this is another example just showing how the core, the soul in the middle, and all the different types of expression that any given incarnation, the soul can take any of these pattern expressions.
With this, with the sum sum, the way you have it, I guess in the previous slide, what are the words? Because we really can't see them, or I can't see them. Maybe someone else can. What are they saying? So you got like red, orange, and then you have a slice inside, yellow, orange, a slice.
Oh, these were, they're just different expressions of different types of color.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, that's nothing relevant. That's nothing I did. It's just saying that, red, orange, peach, smoothie. It's just saying that these are just different. So that's not anything that's important to our discussion. So, and then I like this particular one because it's so, like the all-seeing eye, the eye of consciousness, where you see the soul in different, the iris is made up of the various different forms of expression that the soul can take, but the innermost soul is the innermost level of consciousness. All right, so, but this aspect of the Inturo and the Moja, that is a spirit quality that is most associated, with heredity, and how we inherit certain spirit or a certain quality of spirit through this genetic, physical thing that we have. And so you can see, as spiritualists, we deal with physical things like talisman and sumans that take on a spirit. Once things are combined, can take on a spirit consciousness. So that's the idea here, that the consciousness is coming from the lower world and having some now conscious expression because of how things have been put together or combined. So the Inturo is the spiritual genetic aspect of the father. It is the father's characteristic and spiritual traits which can be inherited. The Moja is the mother's blood, or abusia, the family genetic material. Thus, it is the cooperation of the father's Inturo with the mother's blood, Moja, which is believed to form the child and mold it into the human being. So another important aspect is the other bullet point. The father's Inturo represents the beginning of the child represents the being of the child until the child comes of age. At this point, the Inturo, along with the Sum Sum and Akra, explains how one interacts in the world. And I think that's an important statement if you reflect on all the previous things that we talked about, and how we talked about how epigenetic code can be substantially modified in the early periods of life before the gonads or are mature, or before the person reaches puberty. They don't have the full expression, in other words, of the Sum Sum and the Okra and Sum Sum. They're riding off of that, character and that karma, if you will, if you want to talk in spiritual terms, of the parent. But it's after they get that full maturity that now they have the combined, they become full human being, if you will, and full, expression of what they incarnated with, meaning the Okra and the Sumsum, and what they inherited, the Ntoro and the Moja, combined to have a full expression of self. And it suggests even to us the why we don't have funerals for children, because they don't have that full expression of self yet. They haven't made a mark, and they haven't fully integrated themselves into the world. So this is a spiritual model of the self incarnate. So these are some symbols that help to explain or give a pictorial, because I'm a pictorial person, and that's how I understand things, of how this phenomena is working, and how we incarnate into the world and why we incarnate into the world. So if you look at the upright triangle as Ntoro and the Moja, meaning that coming from the profane or the carnal world or the physical world, and is creating a spiritual consciousness, if you will, that has to be elevated. Then you have the incarnation, so this is what comes from the lower world, what comes from the material world, a sense of consciousness that comes from that. And this is the Okra, our true self, colored in the way how we express ourselves over different generations, and the clothes we've worn over several generations, now incarnating, coming from God into the physical realm to create this consciousness and this sense of awareness. We incarnated and have grasped now our Inqra, our destiny. And so we've incarnated and combined that physical world expression and that ethereal world expression to become, a living incarnate soul to fill out our destiny. But what happens to us along the way, what happens is we don't get this we're fighting for this full conscious awareness of self, but we don't get that because of the epigenetic trauma and intergenerational trauma that's most likely been transmitted through the Ntoro and the Moja, the genetic material that has been transmitted over the years. So we're struggling to become aware. So it suggests to us that our purpose and our clients, whether we are a practitioner of mental health services or a spiritual practitioner, it's suggesting to us that we have to now not just treat the person that's in front of us, but we're treating their ancestors. That person is coming to us as a representative of their ancestors. Like what we do in the field of psychology and mental health, we do a family of origin history and review assessment with the person, because it's like, I need to know your people and where you come from. And that helps me understand the position that you're in now. But as spiritual practitioners, we should do the same thing, and we can go deeper. Like, who are your ancestors? What have they gone through and before now? So I know what I'm seeing. What have they gone through before? So I know what I am seeing now. So what I'm seeing now is an expression and a representation of ancestors, because what we come to do in this incarnate life is to solve our family problems through elevating our consciousness. We solve our family problems, i.e. we break our generational curses. So this is why we come to this world, is to break our family curses and to fix the problems of what is going on in our family. And we do that through elevating ourselves and becoming conscious and becoming aware. And then we do what is our mandate. Even the Bible knows that our purpose is to be fruitful and multiply, meaning now that we become aware, now we teach this conscious awareness, and it's encoded because we fixed the problem. So we fixed problem solving into our genetic code. So when people come to us spiritually, that's what our imperative is to do, is to help them solve their family problem. And so I think that, you know, this, if we look at this in terms of how we can create a holistic, if we have that understanding, we can have a holistic view of the person that's coming to us, and we can help address and heal the spiritual component of themselves, and then direct them to appropriate systems, as like Sister Andrea spoke of, that are culturally oriented and can direct them to cultural center approaches like the Council of Elders. You know, we can begin to create a system of healing the whole person. So, you know, just speaking to us as spiritual practitioners, that's what we are doing. We're feeding the person's soul when we feed them the egg and we feed them the eto, and the red and the white. We're feeding them the entoro, and we're feeding them the moja. And we're saying to their spirit, and we're saying to like, be whole. You know, you've been damaged. You have some injury to your spirit. Be whole again. And it sends a spiritual, a real signal to the soul that it can transform. So if we can heal a person and suggest to their soul and to their sum and their toro, and that, you know, that there is something, you know, that there is repair that should happen, and we can send them to the right, you know, systems to support that. You know, I think that is a holistic approach of healing that we can have, you know, in our community. So that's, in a nutshell, those are my thoughts, and this is my preliminary understanding of how epigenetics impacts, you know, our community and our culture as a people. So any questions that anyone would have, I'm very much willing to entertain.
Yes, thank you very much, Baba. This was a very good talk.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question about you kind of brought it up in terms of the way that parents interact with children, but are there any studies showing the trend being reversed? That, let's say with the rats, let's say they have a better relationship with the mother, you don't have that same kind of gene expressed.
Actually, when I expand this talk, I'll include that, because within that same article, the same study, they showed how there was a low grooming mother a high grooming mother who was put with who was born from a low grooming mother. So they switched the mothers, and they showed how that switch helped to kind of mediate or mitigate some of the expression. So it can be reversed. So none of this is it's not like it's written in stone. It can be reversed. So, and that's what I was saying with the slide where I said that it's experience in, experience out. So that's what I'm suggesting to you, is that we got here through experience. And that's what, in the previous talk, that's what the point was, is that, you know, what the Western sciences and Western therapy professional approaches realize is that you didn't come by this trauma through talking. So no one's going to talk you out of that trauma, but you came in through an experience. And so you have to have experiences that process you out of that. You know, so if you had lack of hugs, if you will, that caused you this damage, now you need a succession of hugs to take you out of it. So yes, it can be reversed.
Midasi.
Mm.
All right, Brother Trey Seals, you have your hand up?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that amazing topic. Thank you for the invitation. I believe I'm doing the work that you're talking about, and have been for many years, on how to rewire my patterns, some inherited, some reinforced through current experiences. From this system, from this approach, can you speak more to how I can continue work as an adult to continue to rewire those
Okay.
patterns?
So that would require me knowing your specific circumstance, which might not be appropriate for this, setting. But what I would say to you in general is that, if you have an experience, whatever particular experience it might be, you have to look at, okay, what was lacking there in that experience that caused this trauma or caused this lack. You have to find some experiences that you would have that will then rewrite that neural development or the neural connectivity that you wrote up or that was written for you from that negative experience. If you cannot reproduce that experience, doing things like yoga or doing things like drumming, doing things like dancing, while holding that thing in mind and just working it out. So if you're part of a drumming class, a dance class, and let's say you're a drummer and you just drum, but I'm going to think about how my father didn't hug me or how he used to abuse, and I'm gonna beat it out. What happens is what the brain says is that anytime there's movement, that automatically translate into competence. So when there's no movement and we freeze, that's the most hallmark aspect of trauma, when you totally defeated. And so only thing you can do is play dead because there's no other option.
Right.
So that's what is suggested to the brain by freezing or lack of movement or shutting down or disassociating. But if you're moving, it's just like, okay, this is not good, but we're dealing with it. Yeah, we're dealing with it. Yeah, it's going to happen. If you keep moving, it's going to work it out. It's going to help release it. So that's what I was saying, June.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I would like, Kwaw, for you to talk about in terms of the traditional system. So, first, thanks for the talk. It's very good information, very theoretical in terms of the information you presented. But from a practical perspective, so I'm always, and I guess maybe that's the chemist in me in terms of like, what's the pill in the bottle at the end of the day? How are we able to use our systems, understanding that there is trauma, to begin that healing process? So I think everyone probably on this call realize, they're traditionalists or spiritualists at one level or at some aspect on the spectrum. So what's the practicality in terms of taking away to begin that journey? So for example, my family, and I spoke to you about this before, we have a history of alcoholism. People, for me, that's like, I'm not even interested in even drinking like that because I've seen the effects of it. But as a traditionalist, how do we begin to use our traditions in order to be able to move the needle in terms of going in that direction to create healing?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think that, in addition to that, understanding what we're doing, with certain rituals when we feed a toe and things like that. But when a person comes to us, I think it's imperative to change our mindset and switch our mindset to the understanding that this person is a representation of their ancestors, and to find out what is it that their ancestors need, because that's why this person is here. That's why they're here before me, and that's why they even came to this earth. Like, people think that they came to, play the guitar and, be a psychologist, or be an engineer or a scientist, and, I love to play music. They think that that's their, no, that's the sum sum, that's the thing that energizes them to do what they do. But they're supposed to use that to fix the problems of their ancestors. And in approaching the person in that way and doing the assessment when we're doing, spiritual work, spiritual reading, understanding, okay, what is it that this person is going to need? So it's hard to definitively say what is going to be exact appeal, but I think the approach has to be that understanding and then listening from that person's spirit. And when we're reading that person, find out what it is that, you know, that their purpose is or their function is, so that we can begin to put them on that path to begin to remedy some things. And if we find out that maybe alcoholism is a part, you know, of their ancestral, you know, experience, you know, whatever the spirit might prescribe for them will be one thing, but also we have to know that, okay, what type of supports and resources, you know, do we, you know, tap that person, you know, into. I don't think that there's one magic bullet, but I think, so in a sense, this was theoretical from the standpoint of understanding approaches. We have to have a mindset and an approach. And from having that mindset and approach, the particulars will fall out depending on the case, you know. So that's what I could say to that, because I don't think there's one, you know, magic bullet thing to do, if you get what I'm saying. And even in even outside of the spiritual aspect, even for professionally, there's you know, we have this whole concept of evidence-based approaches in our system, but I'm just not a fan of evidence-based approaches because it's just cookie cutter. And I always take an eclectic approach with my clients. I mean, I let them and their experience tell me how to treat them. You know, so that's kind of even from that standpoint. But I have a basic approach though that I take with them.
Dr. Tano, Angela Tano, you had a hand up, you had a question?
Oh, greetings, everyone. No, I didn't have a question. I was just applauding for a great presentation. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions? If not, it's 8:21 right now, so I would like to definitely thank you, Obrafohene, for doing this presentation. I think it's given us a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. I think it's just the beginning of this discussion. There's a lot of work to be done in this area. It's a lot of healing that we need to do as African practitioners, as healers. So I mean, I've evolved to the point now where I don't think it's even appropriate for us to call ourselves priests, because priest is one replicating what Europeans are calling their spiritualists, when in fact what we do as healers is way, way, way more than that. You know, it's way. So I think the term healers for Confos is probably more appropriate than the word priest, which we have used and throughout our time here as calling ourselves. But that's only correlating what we are doing with their stuff. And I think it's really time for us to get our minds out of that set. You know, let's stop making it equivalent to what Europeans would call it. We're going to call it what we call it and do what we do with it. So for them, that's what they understand it to be. But for us, that's not what we understand it to be. So again, thank you. I appreciate your conversation. Thanks again. And we definitely look forward to hearing you talk again. We have a sister, Queer Melody. She has a hand up.
Paucho, and thank you. This is an excellent presentation, as was the previous presentation. My question is, what is the interaction of fine work and therapy since you're a professional mental health, since you're a mental health professional, what is your interaction of fine work and therapy, especially does a client have to ask for like a reading and get therapy?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and that has to be dealt with very carefully, because you know, as a licensed practitioner, I don't want to, I can't, I have to be careful with having dual roles or doing something that's going to be perceived as outside of the bounds of professional best practice or ethics. So what I do, but mostly what I do is I use my spiritual knowledge to become aware and to assess the person at the core issue. So I may not ever reveal that to the person, but it informs my approach and what I do and what I suggest. Now, the more centered the person is, culturally centered or African centered the person is, I can directly broach those topics. And then I can more easily move the person when appropriate into, a traditional spiritual setting. And we can kind of go back and forth between those two as appropriate. Or the spirit may interject and let me know that, oh, the person needs this. And depending on how open or centered the person is, even when I'm doing therapy, it's like, okay, I was informed to approach you in this way, or to suggest that you need this. The spiritual aspect or the spiritual cleanup in addition to what we're doing. But where I have clients that just aren't centered at all, it just makes me aware. And I just kind of and so now being aware, I'm informed of things, how to, direct this person and kind of move. And it takes longer, it's more difficult. And sometimes those people, because they're just not there with it, that, I can't get them really what they need. But those people who are consciously centered, I can more easily get them the healing, that's needed. But European center approaches is very much a problem, because you really can't, you just kind of, you hustling the people for money almost, because you have a situation to where you see what the real situation needs, but you can't give it to them. And it's not just even the discipline, the person themselves may even balk at the solution because they're just consciously not there. So in other words, the European Center approach to treatment really only requires you or allows you to treat the person, not to cure or heal the person. So that's why I say it's like a money hustle. So it just keeps them bobbing along, with you. And it's very difficult to get them to process out of treatment, because that's really what treatment is supposed to be. It's supposed to be, whereas I'm supposed to teach you how to live and get what you're getting from me in your natural setting. But it's very difficult to do that with the European Center approaches.
Pastor, we're going to take one last question. Brother Kwabena in the chat asked, given the epigenetics can cause physical changes in the brain, what is your perspective on pharmaceuticals being used to help rewire the brain in the service of freeing up the spirit?
Yeah, the pharmaceuticals are not going to rewire the brain. They're just going to suppress certain expressions. And I would only recommend pharmaceuticals to the standpoint of you have a severe case. So if you have a case, because I used to take the approach of like, oh no, I'm not with any of that pharmaceutical, Western medicine, dope pushers, because I still see to a certain extent, I see psychiatrists or even doctors as dope pushers, and that's how they train them as dope pushers, legal dope pushers. But then when I started working in like youth detention centers and things like that, and some of them guys are so gone, it's like either we're gonna get him this pill or he gonna kill himself or somebody. So he needs this pill. And that's the only way I can even have a conversation with him, is if he has this pill. So that's when I understood that there's a role and a place for it, but it's not a fix. It's just a placeholder. And you have to understand it as a placeholder, that, that you're going to get back to it and fix. It's almost like a scaffold or something, or that if you're in construction, that you just kind of build a stilt for it until you can build this appropriate structure. It's never meant to be permanent. So you can use it, but it's not meant to be permanent.
Okay, thank you. Again, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Thank you, Obrafohene, appreciate it.
Yes.
Our next event, for those who are aware, we're having our Comcasi this year. We're flying down to Florida. So if you are not planning to physically attend, we are going to have a virtual option on Saturday. So you're more than welcome to participate in that. With that, we're going to have an update on the Council of Elders. We're going to talk about spiritual callings. How do you know? We're all going to talk about the burial society, and that's going to be in the evening session. So creating a burial society, or really, how do you send your ancestors to the land of Insamaf? Or what are the things that needed to be done in order for you to help your loved ones transition to the land of ancestors? So there are rituals and things that need to be done to aid in that process. And then we're also going to do a presentation on how to survive America when the shit hits the fan. So this will actually be a rebroadcast of a presentation that I did with IKG that you guys will be able to witness, and we'll have some conversations on it, just like food, increasing your food security and just knowing how to survive from the land and what's around you. So it's going to be exciting. We're excited to go down there to support Nana Kwaku Sechi and his group. So it should be really good. So again, thank you. Our next presentation for the lecture series will be October 22nd. And the topic is discussion is, do you identify as Black or African American? So that's going to be an interesting discussion, and that is going to be led by Nana Ama Willock, who will be leading that presentation. So again, thank you all for all coming out. Please tell somebody about us and enjoy your evening. Thank you.
Peace, brother.
Peace.